My name's David. So glad to meet you. If I don't know you, I'm a pastor here at Treeline. And I want to just start off by just highlighting our vision statement, okay? And the reason is for what is happening in this passage is it's fitting. It says this, very simple vision statement. We exist to cultivate authentic followers of Jesus, right? You came in, you got it on your handout. It's like very simple. That's what we're about. And so just this is what we want to do at Treeline. We want to create a community and a culture that really helps people figure out who Jesus is, helps people learn what it means to become a follower of him, and then invite them to follow Jesus with us if they want to. And so this is actually why we teach through books of the Bible. There's a lot of different churches that do a lot of different things. The kind of normal thing you'll find at Treeline is we just are teaching through a book of the Bible. And for a really long time now, we've been teaching through the Gospel of Matthew. And the reason we're just doing this is we really have an intention to let Jesus say what he wants to say to us. And this is one of those passages. Jesus has some things to say today. You feel that? Walked in, you're like, oh, all right, Jesus, okay. We're in Matthew 25, and it's the second part of like a 2-chapter response of Jesus to a question that he asked last week. We kind of started, and this is the question that started our time in this last week. The disciples come to Jesus, and they ask him about the end of the age. And they basically say, Jesus, when are these things going to happen? When is this current kingdom, this world going to kind of end and the next one begin? And it's really interesting because if you're kind of like a modern reader living in the modern world, we have certain ideas about things. And I think because we know a little bit about Jesus, we know he's like a good guy. Like we're not sure about the church. We're not sure about Christians. But Jesus is a good guy, right? He's like objectively just a nice, good, moral person. Everyone agrees with that, whether you're a Christian or not. You're just like that, whatever that was good. The church, not sure, but that was good. And so we have this, thinking about Jesus that when they ask this question about like the end times, and really they're asking about like Jewish judgment day stuff. You'd think that Jesus might kind of like ignore the question because he does this often. I don't know if you noticed this. Whenever there's a bad question, he just is like, let's answer a different question. He does this all the time. He's like, I'm actually not concerned with answering your questions. I'm concerned with answering the right questions. And so he could have just ignored this question. Or he could have even corrected it. Like, hey, come on, man, that's not what this is all about. Like, don't get caught up in that end times. Like, God's coming back. There's going to be a judgment stuff. I'm just here to teach you how to live your life here and now. Let's focus on that. He doesn't say that. And he could have. I just want us to notice that Jesus doesn't do these things. Instead, what he does is very interesting. He actually gives the single longest answer to a question that he does in the entire New Testament. Okay? And we read like a tiny, tiny part of it this morning. It's 2 chapters long. So the Sermon on the Mount is the longest kind of like single message of Jesus in the New Testament, and the second longest is right here. And so it's this description of what it's going to be like when he returns to bring his kingdom to earth. And he thinks it's important enough that he's like, I'm going to give a lot of time to this. And so we're going to look at the last 2 stories today. Ryan read both of them. One is a parable, and one is just a literal description. And so here's what Jesus has to say. We're going to kind of read some of this again. Verse 14. He says, for it's going to be like a man who goes on a journey. Like he's just describing the world. And he's saying, and this man, he called his servants and he entrusted to them his property. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away, right? And this is kind of the state we're in today. We're like, where's Jesus? He went away. And he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them. And he made 5 talents more. And then he who had the 2 talents, he also made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So this is Jesus describing the world. And he's saying, man, here's like the thing you need to understand. Here's the scene he sets up for us. And here's the first thing we need to notice. And I know it's so simple, but like we got to just notice it. Jesus's first thing is this. Hey, there's actually a master. There is a master. And when he's describing, like, as the kingdom's gonna come, he's like, this is the first thing you need to know. The first character introduced in the story isn't us. It's not actually one of the servants. It's we're introduced to the master. And so one of the things we need to learn is that we're not the master. And this is actually like a really big climactic thing that actually crashes into our lives. And if you're not familiar with church, this is one of the very first things the Bible presents to us. This is Genesis 1:1. It's like, in the beginning, God, right? This idea that there is actually a master. This world and our lives actually do not just belong to us, but there is a master, and we are not him. And it's interesting, we may think that we are, and we may even live like we are, but Jesus is telling us that we are not. And this is actually the first and most important thing that we understand about life. There is a master and we are not him. And the second thing in this story, he's just setting up the context of this. He just says, hey, your life, the things that you think belong to you, the things we think belong to us, are really just on loan from him. The things that we have, they don't actually belong to us. They've been like entrusted to us by our master. Jesus has like a very un-American description of our personal property. I don't know if you saw that. He's like, hey, your personal property, it's not your personal property, right? It's mine. Like I own it. It's been entrusted to you. And because of this, there's this expectation that the things he's given us will actually be maximized in this world for his purposes. And then the third thing, super quickly, we just see from the setup of this story is that there's a day coming where the master will return and he will settle accounts with us. And I just want you to see, like, this is not my ideas. Like, this is what Jesus says very clearly. He's like, this is what the world is like. There's going to be a day coming where this master who has entrusted us with things, he's going to come back and he's going to see what we've done with them. Jesus says this is what the kingdom of heaven coming will be like. And so here's a question. Is this the way we view our lives? Right? Because Jesus is trying to give us a description of the way things are. And so the question is, does the reality, as Jesus paints it, line up with the way we view our reality? Right? Is this the way we view our time, our money, like our gifts, our talents? Do we view these as things that have been entrusted to us by God, and that there's going to come a day where he's going to basically settle accounts with us? Well, it's very important we understand we might have a certain view of our life, but this is how Jesus views your life. This is the way he views the world. And he's speaking today, trying to explain that to all of us and say, this is the way things are. And this is his story of what it will be like when the end comes, that a master is going to come back. Will you be a faithful steward of these things? And then he tells this story, right? There's three different servants, and really they fall into two groups, right? There's one group that are good stewards of what the master has given them, and there's another servant that's not. And so the first servants, they're kind of interesting, right? Ryan read this. They take what the master gave them. One gets 2 kind of talents, the other gets 5, and they both go out into the world and they try to make something of what this master has given them. And they end up doubling the master's investment in them, right? The one who has 2 ends up with 4. The one who starts with 5 ends up with 10, and they take risks doing this, right? Like financial risks kind of in the marketplace, in the world, trying to figure out how to leverage this, but it pays off. And in the end, when the master returns, he's pleased with them, and it says he welcomes them into his joy. But the last servant, he ends up burying what the master gave him. Right? Iconic image from Jesus, right? A lot of you have heard of this, like burying talent, right? This is from the New Testament. Jesus is the one who spoke this. And this last servant, he doesn't take any risks. He doesn't make any investment with what God has given him, but instead he actually just buries it. And Jesus says that the reason he buried it, did you guys catch that? It says because he was scared that if he doesn't, he might not be able to pay back the master. And so he goes, so this is why I buried it. And investments actually were pretty shaky in the ancient world, right? So even like the master comes back, he's like, you should have at least invested it in a bank, right? So I could have like got some of this inflation that's going on, right? He's like, at least I could have gotten a little bit of that, but instead you buried it. And so I got no return on my investment at all. My investment actually is worth less, right, than it was when I originally gave it to you. But investments were really shaky in ancient times. And so this wasn't just like a sure thing, like, just put it in a quick, like a CD or whatever, like you'll make a little bit. If you put it in a bank, actually there was like a pretty not zero chance that that bank is gonna go to zero and you're gonna lose all of your investment, right? So there wasn't just like there's some safe place he could have done this. No, what he did was actually the only thing that could guarantee he could pay back his master exactly what he was given. So that's the point of the story. He does exactly what he has to do to be able to pay back exactly with no risk. And so here's a question. What does it look like for us to bury the things God has given us today? Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to do this, And I mean, I think one of the simple ways is just that you take something God entrusted to you to use for his purposes, and you'd use it for yourself, or you'd use it for something that he does not value, right? Because it's his stuff, right? And so that's one way you could kind of bury the talent. I actually have a line in my Bible next to this passage. It just says, what does your bank account say about your soul? And I wrote it there because I'm like, the Bible says where your treasure is, there your heart is also. And so like, am I spending my time, these resources on things that Jesus values or just things that I value? But it isn't just about money, right? Some of you in this room, you are like great business minds. Like you really are. You're just amazing at starting things. You just have something in you that does that really well. Some of you are great with people. Some of you are like tremendous like doctors and artists and teachers. Like the question is, what are you doing with what you've been given? And one of the things you can do is you can waste what God's given you by spending it on yourself. But it's interesting, there's another way you can bury your talent, and it's actually by simply doing nothing with it at all. You can squander the things God has given you through laziness and actually through insecurity. And it isn't that you just waste them on yourself, but you just like don't use them at all. Like it could have been that like God gave you something where it was like, man, like your ability to do science and technology and engineering, it's like you actually have in you the ability to like take the cost of energy like down 100 times for the whole population on planet Earth through this new technology that you have the ability to create. You could end up helping lift 1 billion people out of poverty, but you become like absolutely amazing at Fortnite. I mean, that's probably happening today. There's a lot of people who play Fortnite. There's people who are in the world who they're actually like taking something that God has put in them that is beautiful and amazing and worthy of doing something profound and courageous in the world, and they're actually wasting it on something, partly because they're insecure, maybe have nothing real to offer to the world, maybe just because they have no bigger vision for their life. But that happens, right? It's like you could have cured cancer, but instead you settled just scrolling through quick dopamine hits on your phone and working as a barista. And there's nothing wrong with baristas. The question isn't how big of an impact are you making on the world. It's just about being faithful to what you've been given, right? The person that's given 2 talents, he makes 2 more. The person that's given 5 makes 5 more. The question is, are you being faithful with what God's given you? And it's interesting, like the end of the story, right? It isn't actually God goes, hey, you brought 10 and you brought 1. And so the one who has 10 has more, so that's better. It's actually not how the story goes. The issue is that 2 were faithful and zealous for the things the master cared about, and 1 didn't care. The third servant didn't care about these things. The only thing he's concerned about is not doing anything wrong. And it's interesting. It isn't just that he's lazy. This servant's laziness is actually incredibly calculated, right? He buries the money because this is the only way he can ensure he'll be able to pay back his master the exact amount he's given. And listen, you have to understand, this is his goal. He wants to pay his master back exactly what he was given. Not more, not less. So that at the end of his story, he can say, I owe you nothing. We're even. The problem with this servant isn't that he didn't multiply the money. It's actually, the problem seems to be why he didn't. Look at verse 24. This is his description. He says, this master, I knew you to be a hard man. He's like speaking to him. And he's saying, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. He says, so I was afraid. He's like, my view of you, my picture of you, it made me afraid. And so I went and I hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. Even though he's in the same receiving line as the other servants and he gets a talent from the master, he has a completely different view of the master than the others. The others view the master as kind and generous. And when they come back, they say, man, like God, you gave me this thing and look what I did with it. Like I tried to multiply it. Here you go. There's this like incredible relational talk. God, you gave me this. This servant never talks like that. It's interesting. He says, I hid your money in the ground. Here, have what is yours. They highlight his generosity towards them and the relationship they have. And these other servants are delighted to show God and kind of share with him in what they were able to do in the world with what he gave them. But the other servant, his view of the master is completely different. He's not generous. He's stingy. He's brutal and exacting, reaping where he doesn't even sow. How do you view God? Because that's the question that's being posed right here in this story. It's about two groups of servants, but it's actually about two different views of God. One group views him as generous and approachable, having given them so much. And the other views him as withholding and exacting. And it's very interesting. Your view of God, how you view him, it actually will determine the way you live with the things he has given you. And there's one servant whose view of the master is completely different than the others. And because of this, he buries his talent. And now I know the world we live in today, and so I think there's a possibility we could go, well, hey, wait a minute. Like these others got more. Right? It's like one was given 5, one was given 2. This dude was only given 1. Like that's not a lot, like the others were given more. They could have been more risky because they had more privilege. But listen, 1 talent, do you know how much 1 talent is? Is actually 20 years' wages. So like 1 is like this massive, massive inheritance that could be leveraged in like an almost innumerable amount of ways, right? It's like this huge, huge privilege. 1 talent is not small, it's massive. And so listen, God does give different people different gifts, different abilities, different stories. And I think even when you walk in here, you might be like, dude, I'm the 1. Like I know the 2, I know the 5. It seems like a lot of people around here already got 10 to begin with. I've got like 1. I don't even know if I have 1. I have like half a 1. No, I'm serious, I know that. I know there's people in the room, you walk in and you feel like that's the story of your life. But you have to understand what Jesus is telling in this story. He's saying the one thing God doesn't give is cheap gifts. He just doesn't do that. He's actually given you something in your life that is extremely valuable. It may be your personality trait, it may be your intellect. It may actually be the difficult story that brought you to who you are today that actually has value in your life. Your life has value. God's given you something that's important. There's no one who walks through this life with nothing to offer. Every single one of us is made in the image of God, and that means we've been entrusted with something of incredible value. But it also means that there's a day where the master of those things is going to come back and settle accounts with how we use the life he gave us. So that's the first story. And what he's going to do is he's going to kind of take the analogy off, okay? He's like giving us a parable. He's like, it's like a master and servants. And he's going to pull the analogy off, and he's just going to give us a description of things. Okay, this is what he says next. I'm actually going to read this in its entirety, just so you can hear what Jesus has to say for yourself. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, meaning I'm going to die on a cross, I'm going to raise from the dead, but I'm going to actually come back after that. I'm going to bring my kingdom back. So he says, when he comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations. And he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Why? He says, well, for when I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. But then the righteous, they answer him in this moment. So see this is in verse 37. They say, Lord, like when did we see you hungry and feed you? Like this didn't happen. Or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick and in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. But then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, you did not welcome me. I was naked, you did not clothe me. I was sick, and I was in prison, and you did not visit me. And then they will also answer, saying, Lord, what are you talking about? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and we did not minister to you? And he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. So that's how Jesus ends the second longest kind of discourse he has on the way the world is. The longest is the Sermon on the Mount. He goes, this is a description of life in the kingdom. And then the second longest is what it's going to be like when that kingdom comes. And this story, the analogy is stripped away, and we just have a very literal description of King Jesus. And it says that when he returns in his glory, that all people will stand before him. And it's interesting. It says all people from all nations. And it says that it doesn't really matter what you believe. It doesn't matter kind of where you live, like what nation, what ethnicity, what story you kind of came from. Everyone stands before him. And this isn't something to move past quickly. You know, Jesus is the one speaking these things. And, you know, Jesus, the one thing you have to say about him is that he cares about people. Like, it's impossible to read the New Testament and be like, this is someone who's uncaring about people. No, he cares tremendously about human beings. And he cares really deeply about their inner lives. And Jesus says that at the end of time, he personally will be the dividing line between humanity. He says that he personally will take people and put them on his left, and he will take other people and put them on his right. And then one group he will speak this over. The king will say, come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Like it's this, it's just unimaginably good tidings. It's like, you who are blessed by my Father, like the kingdom that's been coming from the beginning, the foundations of the world, you're going to inherit this. Come into this story. And the other group is told something that is as bad as that is good. He says, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. I just want a quick stop. This isn't in my notes. We just need to say this. Hell is not something Christians thought up and told people so that we could keep people in church and keep people scared so they'd stay with an organization. Hell is actually the thing Jesus talked about just about more than anything else. If you ask him, Jesus, why'd you come? Like, why'd you get off your throne and come all the way down here? Why'd you suffer? Why'd you die? He'd be like, because of that. Because there's two ends to the human story. One is impossibly good and one's actually impossibly bad. And so Jesus just lays it out and he says, these are the two things I'm going to say to either group of people. I will speak this over them. And I know that every single one that's in this room this morning, I know we have opinions on this. Like, I'm with you. I'm a human being. I've got an emotional inner life and I feel a certain way about the world and about people and about things. And if you're like me, you walk into the room and you have a certain kind of intuition about you, about how things are going to play out. And even in the end, you'd be like, I feel like this is probably how things are going to be in the end. We just have these intuitions. But I want you to just hear Jesus saying, this is what will happen. This isn't a theory for him. It's not an emotional thing for him. It's not him saying like, hey, you feel this, I feel this. This is Jesus saying, this is what will happen because I'm going to be the one doing it. I don't have questions about it. I know it will happen this way because I will do it. And so here's the great question. If you hear this and you look at those two groups and you say, look, I'm not even sure if this whole Jesus thing is legit, but if that's legit, I really want to be in the first category. The question is, what is the difference between these two groups of people? And this really is the great question. It's interesting. In Matthew 24, they ask this question, when? And he's like, the when, okay, we'll talk about the when. But it's really important that you're the kind of person who ends up in that place. It's not so important when. What's really important is that you hear what I'm saying and you end up on the right, not the left. You end up as the blessed one, not the cursed one. You end up as the one who actually is ushered into my kingdom, not kept out of it. And so what do we need to do? Who do we need to be? How do we end up in the group of people that Jesus says are blessed? It's probably one of the most important questions you could ever ask about your life. This is what Jesus says in verse 20, or in chapter 26. So right after this, he shares this story, kind of drops this bomb, right? It's like a mic drop moment. Surely the crowd is kind of hushed. And then this is what he says next. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, this is chapter 26, he said to his disciples, now you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. So he shares all these stories, and then the very next thing is he's like, in a couple days I want to be hung up on a cross and killed, okay? And Matthew, like Jesus and Matthew together are like conspiring to help us understand this passage correctly, okay? And the reason Matthew puts this line immediately after these stories is because Jesus said it immediately, but he doesn't necessarily copy every single thing as it happens. He's trying to tell a story that really happened, but trying to lead you along in a way so that you see Jesus clearly and you answer the right questions. And so Matthew puts this right after this because he's like, look, if you read what Jesus is saying too quickly, you might walk away and think, okay, there's an end coming and there's a master. And so I need to make sure I am a good steward. There's a God who obviously cares about those who are disenfranchised. He cares about injustice. He cares about taking care of the least of these. Therefore, I need to become this kind of person because this is the difference between me being accepted by God or being rejected by him. Am I a good steward? Have I done justice? And what we might end up thinking is that my life and my actions and my good works are going to determine in the end if I'm accepted by God or not. And so you leave this place and you might even hear these words. You might come in here and have this like powerful moment where like something is shaken awake in you and you go, this is real and this is important. I have to be the right kind of person. And so what you do is you grit your teeth and you leave and you try to become the kind of person where your life and your actions and your good works end up making you one of these groups of people. After all eternity hangs in the balance. But here's the problem. If that's what you leave thinking and you just go, I need to become this kind of person, the right kind of person, it won't work. It won't work. It never has worked. And it's really interesting. The only thing that kind of a response could have is it would turn you into the kind of over-calculated servant who ends up missing the point of his life in the first place. If you look closely at every one of these stories, there's actually one through line that cuts through every single one. We didn't even have time to read all of them. We just read the last two. But there's one through line that goes through all of them. And if you look at the last story, what is the difference, okay? The difference between these two groups of people. And it seems obvious, right? The story we just read, it seems like there's some disciples who actually cared for the least of these and some who did not. There's some who did justice and mercy and some who didn't. And this is the difference. But look what it says. I want you to look closer. Look at verse 40, if you got it. Verse 40 says this. Jesus says, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Now, when you're looking at specific words, you want to be careful because sometimes a very specific word will be different in different translation, right? But what's interesting is this word one is actually in every single translation you'll read of this, because it's actually one of the specific things in the Greek that's there. It's one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. And the people who are cursed, in verse 45, he says the same thing. Truly, I say to you, you did not do it to one of the least of these. You did not do it to me. And so there's this interesting thing happening here where there's two groups of people. It isn't actually about them being weighed on a scale, right? That some did mercy and justice enough to be counted as righteous by God and the others didn't. It isn't actually a scale where one person made it and the other person didn't. Actually, these two groups of people are having very similar things being said about them, but they're being judged on a completely different set of rules. Let me explain. The first group, it isn't that they always did justice and mercy. It isn't that they always fulfilled the law of God and to do good to those that God loves. No, but Jesus looks at their life. And this is what's happening in this moment. Jesus is looking at their life and he's seeing through their story and he's finding one moment of goodness and justice, just one single person in need that you had this moment of kindness towards. And Jesus finds that in your story. He picks it up and he holds it up and he goes, there, look, there it is. Righteous. You did it. You were merciful. And in that moment, it's you were really doing it for me. That was for me. And in the second group, he does the exact opposite. There's one single failure. And Jesus points that out. And he said, you did not do it for one of the least of these. There's that one person that you walked by that one day who had need and you could have met it. And you just walked by on the other side of the road. And it was really me you were walking by on the side of the road that day. You see, it isn't a scale. It's actually a totally different set of rules. Why? Well, because the difference between these people isn't primarily how they lived their life, although surely there might have been some difference. The primary difference is that one of these groups of people is actually under the mercy and grace of God, and the other group is not. One group actually knows the king, and the other has only heard things about him. And this is what actually every single one of these stories are saying. This is the through line. What's the difference between the servants in the first story, right? It's not just that one of them made a profit and the other one didn't. That is true, but the story focuses on the why. Why didn't this servant invest his life in the kingdom of God? The story tells us why. He didn't know the master. He didn't know him. His idea of the master is completely twisted and false. It's not just twisted, it's exact upside down from the true story. His idea of the master makes it clear he hasn't experienced grace and he has no relationship with him at all. He only knows him in the abstract. And so he views him like this cruel taskmaster reaping where he doesn't sow. I mean, it's almost an impossibly upside down view of God. Because this is the God who became flesh so that he could bleed out for us. This view that he has of God is that he's a hard man. He reaps what he didn't sow. He takes things unjustly. And it's so interesting because God actually does bring injustice into the world, but it's injustice against himself. He does reap what he doesn't sow. He actually bears the sins and punishment that he didn't earn so that we could receive a salvation that we couldn't afford. The point of the story is actually this servant has never received the grace from his master. He doesn't know him. And it's because of this that he's actually completely unable to live like the other servants. Here's the through line of all the stories and everything that Jesus is trying to lead up to in all of this. It's just this. Do you know Jesus? Do you know him? Has your life been changed by an encounter with the grace and mercy of the man on the cross? Do you know the King? It says when Jesus had finished all these things, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. You see, at the end of time, we're not going to stand before a set of scales and we're going to stand up on it. And all of the things we've done that are good and all the things we've done are bad are going to kind of weigh in the balance. And then God's going to make a determination about whether we're righteous or not. That is not what these stories are saying. They're saying at the end of time, there is a man named Jesus who has scars on his physical body, who will be crowned king, and he will sit on his throne. And the question will be whether we know him and he knows us or not, period. At the end of the day, he's the one who decides. At the end of the day, he's the one who separates. At the end of the day, he's the one who speaks blessing or cursing upon people. And the only thing that matters, at least for him, is whether he knows us or not, whether we know him. Because if he knows us, he's going to say, oh man, hold on. There was this one moment. You probably don't remember it. But there's this one little moment of justice that you had, and I saw it. You're in. You're righteous. Let's go. Blessed by my Father. And if you don't know him, you're actually going to be judged not based off of his grace and mercy over your life. You're going to be judged based off of your moral performance, period. And if there's even a single moment of failure in your life, he's going to say, man, I'm sorry. But heaven is only for people who are righteous. Totally and completely. And you are not. And you see, Jesus Christ, he's not trying to weigh out between those who are good and those who are bad. He's actually trying to weigh out between those who are underneath his blood and his grace and his mercy, and those who have actually said, I do not need this. I'm good. Thank you very much. And in this room, that's the two groups of people who sit here today. There's always two groups in Scripture, never three. If you ever notice that, never three. Jesus always goes, at the end of the day, everyone funnels into one of two groups. Either the blood of this crucified Savior covers you, covers your story, and you know him. And you don't know him abstractly. You don't know a version of him you made up in your own head, but you know the real Jesus because you've met him at the foot of his cross, pleading for mercy and grace. Or you don't know him. And because he's the king, because he's the one who's paid the cost for salvation, knowing him is the only thing that matters. So do you know Jesus? And have you had an encounter with the grace and mercy that's changed your life? Really, I just want to just let it sit for a second. Like, do you know Jesus? Really? There was a time in my life where I knew a lot about Jesus, but I didn't know him. There was a time in my life where I went to church, I'd read a lot of books, and I knew a lot of things about God, but I did not know him. I didn't know what it was like to be under his grace. I didn't know what it was like to accept his mercy. I also didn't know what it was like to have a changed life. Because what's true about these servants, right, is like both of them are like, okay, there's a master, and I'm trying to do something in the world so that he can be either proud of me or just not mad at me, right? And one group has had an encounter with the grace and mercy of Jesus, and the other hasn't. Have you had that encounter? Because if you haven't, I'm telling you, it will be impossible for you to be the kind of people in this story. If you want to be a risk-taking, generous steward of all that God has given you, you're never going to actually be that kind of person until you realize God has already given up all he had for you. Until you realize you had nothing to bring to God, nothing to bargain with, and that in that state, God saved you and he bled and died for you. People who have experienced that kind of grace, they actually don't live calculated lives. They live lives of radical and passionate sacrifice and worship and zeal for the one who did that for him. The last time I preached this passage was actually in Iowa City. I was on staff there leading college ministry there called Salt Company. And this is the last sermon that I preached there before we kind of stepped into this 3-year-long journey where we sold our home and changed the plans we had for our lives that led us to Ann Arbor to plant Treeline Church. And I was looking at the notes of this passage because this passage has not just impacted me this week, it's like impacted me in the history of my life as I've read it. And I just want to read what I wrote a few years ago. As I was thinking about my life, trying to follow Jesus, trying to be a steward of the life God had given me. And this is what I wrote. I said, I'm not speaking about these things as someone who is unaffected by these words. This passage is why we are moving. There's nothing inherently wrong with us staying in Iowa City. We love this place. We love our home. We love our friends. We've shed so many tears about the idea of leaving this place. But at the end of the day, we're asking the question, how can we leverage everything we have for the kingdom of God? Not some of what we have, but all of it, all of our lives. We don't just want to be part of the kingdom when it comes, but we want to do everything we possibly can to bring his kingdom to earth now. We want to be good stewards of what God's given us. And our answer is the best way we can steward the things God has given us and care for the things God cares about is actually to leave the home and the people we love and move to a city where it seems there's more need for the gifts that God has given us. These words of Jesus have profoundly shaped our lives, and following them is risky. It isn't safe. It isn't comfortable, but we don't take the words of Jesus lightly. One of the amazing things in this story, and I want to just end on like a little bit of a high note, is there's only two categories of servants, right? There's one who buries the talent, but there's also the others. And the others who leverage it, they actually end up both producing this massive windfall. Like, did you notice that? There wasn't like one who was good investment and one it wasn't. It was just either you buried it or you ended up being like, I'm an incredible investor. Like, I doubled it, like. There isn't a category of servant who tried really hard to live for the king and ends up being not good at it and ends up failing. It's not a category. It's just not there. It's either you don't know the king and so you bury your life in the ground and don't do the right things with it, or you know him and his grace has changed your life and so you just kind of try to leverage your life for the things that he cares about, and every person who does this ends up making a massive impact in the world. Like, there was just a few simple, not that gifted people, like ones, twos, I don't know, whatever amount of talent, it wasn't 5, who helped start this church. Like, people picked up their lives and they moved because they just said, like, Jesus has changed my life. I want to live my entire life for him. I don't want to sit on the sidelines. I want to leverage everything I have for him. And I feel like we're watching this play out, where when you're faithful with the little things God has given you, he ends up doing so much with it in the world. Do you live your life leveraging what you have for the things that God cares about? I don't want you to just get distracted about the end of this story and be like, this is really hard if you end up on the left, not the right. If you're one of those people that Jesus has changed your life, this passage should be so encouraging to you, because it means that at the end of your story, the one thing, the one person that has a say, the one person who's going to speak over your existence forever and determine where you go, that person has already shed his blood on your behalf. He's like, I already gave you my whole life. Like, I've given you everything. I bled and died for you. You think I'm like not going to let you in? You think I'm not going to like pull you into this kingdom? It's like the one standing at the gate is the one who said, take my life and my blood and my grace and my mercy. This should be so unbelievably comforting for you if you're in Jesus Christ. Because if you're in Jesus Christ, he's the one person that decides. And he knows you by name and he loves you. Let's pray.